Hi, and thank you for joining me tonight on Tears' bookstore for my live reading of The Companion's Tale. My name is Astrid, and I am a South African author living in Sweden. Yes, I know, it's crazy. I struggle a lot, especially with the sunlight in the summers and the cold in the winters, but it's a great place to live, so I can't complain really. Well, The Companion's Tale is one of my shorter pieces. It's a tale that's set in the universe I created for The Apprentice Storyteller. And this is one of the tales that are told by storytellers in the Huldrian Empire. And so in The Apprentice Storyteller, we met the greatest storyteller ever. Her name is Viola Illyrian, and she saddles herself with an apprentice in that story, and this is one of the tales that she teaches him. Another really amazing thing, I think, about this particular series of shorter novellas is that each and every one came out of a dream. I started having these very lucid dreams about 15 years ago, and when I woke up it was as if I'd lived the story, and often the continuation came to me in the waking, and I kind of finished the story myself once awake. And I wanted to incorporate all of these tales in some way, and that's how I actually came up with the idea of having a frame story of a storyteller and her apprentice. But I also came to realize over time that these stories are deeper than I originally gave them credit for, and that's why they couldn't stand as short stories nested within a novel, like, for example, 1001 Nights. But that each of the tales needed its own space. And so, hence, the Wordmage's Tales has become its own thing. And so this is why The Companion's Tale is dedicated to dreams and lives loved. Love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. Viktor Frankl. Prologue. Joe looked out over the crowd. There were more people here than he'd ever seen in his life, all pushing each other and murmuring in a drone as persistent as the engines on the Star Traveler's Hope. He looked down at the throng from his vantage point on a balcony on the square's southern side. The people milling below him reminded him of ants, and he couldn't understand how they bore the heat. The sun beat down, blazing its incandescence onto the plaza and its ant-like people. The colonnades and shaded pavilions boxing in the square also teemed with spectators who sipped colourful drinks from glasses steamy with condensation. The colours assaulted Joe's eyes. Everything was bright and garish, unlike the soft tones of brown and ochre he was used to from his home planet. Joe wet his lips. The heat was oppressive, and he wondered what it might do to his voice. Could he perform the whole story as he dreamed he would? Was that even possible under these circumstances? Sweat beaded under his eyes and along his hairline, inching its way down, compelled by gravity in a painstaking process. Shaking himself, Joe tried to focus on the task at hand. He needed to keep this audience captivated, and he had to, above all else, enthrall the city's governor and his advisors, particularly the ambassador from the capital. That lady was Viola's enemy. In his dream, that particular detail had been very clear. More sweat accumulated, muggy and constricting on his skin. The air here was nothing like the dry semi-desert of his home. There the heat stung, and you could find shelter from it in the shade. Here it thickened the air and hung over everything, not allowing breath to pass freely over one's lips. You couldn't escape from it. Movement on a balcony opposite him brought Joe back to the task at hand. Several blobs of colour settled into seats as silence fell over the crowd. Everyone had been waiting for the governor and ambassador. Now that they were here, all eyes swiveled, searching out Joe on his high perch. The boy closed his eyes. It took several deep breaths to steady him. I can do this, he thought. I've been doing exactly this thing every evening on the Star Traveller's Hope, and I also did it at the Merchants' Guild. Air filled his lungs, and Joe's mind played over the dream he'd had as the Star Traveller's Hope landed. He was meant to be here. He was destined to perform this story to these people. He could do this. Suddenly everything came into focus. Joe opened his eyes and looked down at the people gazing up at him. His lips parted, and the words he'd practiced for weeks on the road came pouring out of him with ease. His voice rang true, cutting through the thickness of the air and reaching every ear. In a kingdom far away, but not all that long ago, there lived a beautiful, kind, and generous princess in a shiny palace of crystal glass. She was princess to a small kingdom, which was ruled by her doting father and exquisite though stern mother. However, this tale has little to do with the princess, for in truth it is about her companion. In this distant kingdom, it was customary for the princess to be accompanied wherever she went by another girl her own age. This companion was of common birth, and chosen for her unsightliness, so she should not detract from the princess's beauty and refinement. You may think it odd that a commoner should be elevated to such a position beside a princess. However, in this kingdom it is quite normal. I suppose commoners make for appropriate companions when we think about their most important duty. They had to taste her food to ensure it wasn't poisoned. Commoners are expendable, while nobles are not. With this greatest of honours possible to young girls of lower birth, parents of ugly daughters vied for the chamberlain's attention when occasion required a new companion for the princess. The companion in question was tall and thin, features considered unsightly in this land of short, robust people. Furthermore, her flaxen hair and pale eyes were deemed ugly by the inhabitants, who admired the variety of shades of brown to black hair and brown or green eyes that were common in that place. So this tall, pale girl was chosen at the age of 5 to be the princess's companion. Although I do not know her name, I shall call her Elaine. By all accounts, Elaine was an excellent companion. She was loved by her princess, and in turn doted on Sua Alteza, the princess's title when addressed by her companion. They went everywhere together, did everything in each other's company, and over time, Elaine became a most accomplished young woman. Elaine was kind, and ensured never to be better at anything than her princess was, and yet she also successfully encouraged the princess to improve herself. By the time the princess was to marry, she and Elaine were like sisters, inseparable. Our story begins on the fateful day of the princess's procession, an important event linked to that kingdom's royal engagement customs. Joe almost laughed at himself. There was nothing to worry about. This story he could tell anywhere, under any circumstance. He loved it and had learned it so well it overrode everything and used him to grow brighter than life itself. And the onlookers drank in the words. The Companion's Tale. The princess's mare raced ahead unexpectedly, and Elaine ran as fast as she could in her ceremonial dress. She hurtled after the bolting horse, never taking her eyes off the silk-clothed figure atop it. Elaine's legs pumped, hammering the hard ground beneath her feet. She sprinted with all her might, and, terrified as she was, Elaine found strength to lengthen her strides, charging after the steed almost as fast as it galloped. She ran as she never had before. Her legs propelled her forward until her lungs screamed in torment, and she gasped for air. Dark spots faded in and out of her vision, but she forced herself on, unheeding. Her willpower was an unstoppable force, driving her to remain close to her charge, the purpose of her being. Blinking her eyes in an effort to see, Elaine hurtled on in dread as she watched the purple and gold bundle of silk atop the rampaging beast slip and topple to the ground. Seconds later, Elaine was the first of the retainers to arrive beside the princess, flinging herself on the ground to stop the momentum of her mad rush. She came to a halt beside the prone form, accompanied by the sound of tearing fabric. The princess did not move. Her eyes stared up, glassy and with a pink tinge in their whites. Elaine's hammering heart stood still as she took in the princess's unmoving form. The flowers Waldessa had somehow managed to keep clutched in her fist as she hurtled through King's Park now lay limp on the ground beside her, portent of the lifelessness gripping her beloved mistress's body. A howl escaped Elaine's lips, and she clutched the princess to her. The straggling retinue looked on in dismay at the distraught companion who wept for the loss of that person who had given meaning to her life. No one could come near the princess's body, clasped as it was by the companion who saw and heard nothing beyond her own despair at the limp form she cradled on her knees. Someone tried to pry Elaine off, but she fought, nails becoming claws of anguish while she wept. She bled tears from a heart torn out of her chest and flung into a crevasse of despair. In that world of pain, the companion wasn't aware of the king's guard who arrived with the court physician. She remained oblivious to the cordon forming around her, and it was only when a calloused pair of hands covered her own that Elaine looked up into the hazel eyes of the king's chief investigator. This man was renowned and feared as the king's eyes and ears, but in this moment Elaine thought she detected compassion in his gaze. Raising her hands by the wrist, removing them from the princess's limp body, he said, "The physician must examine the princess." More tears spilled onto Elaine's cheeks while the weight was lifted from her knees. She jerked her hands involuntarily, wanting to clutch at the lifeless form once more, but the investigator kept them prisoner. Through eyes stinging and puffy, the companion absorbed the way the princess's legs dragged, and noted one was bent at an impossible angle. She wrung her hands, and more tears came, blurring the scene around her into a shimmering abstract painting. All the while, Raymond, the king's chief investigator, held her hands. His heart constricted at the sight of the companion's anguish. He brushed aside a stray thought, threatening to take form at the edge of his mind. Instead, he turned his attention to the incident at hand and his conversation earlier that morning with the king. He looked over to where the physician was completing an examination of the princess. From the medical man's expression, the investigator sensed the news was dire. Next, he turned his attention to the guards keeping the crowd at bay and nodded meaningfully towards a distraught companion whose hands he still cradled in his. One of the guards acknowledged the gesture and slipped into the crowd on the other side of the ring, the gap closing behind him in a seamless fusing worthy of a court tailor. Moments later, the same guard returned accompanied by two of the princess's maids. After receiving their instruction to take care of the companion, they hurried towards the disconsolate Elaine, while the investigator rose to his feet. He knew the king and queen would have received news of the calamity by now. They were in the royal garden awaiting the procession. As chief investigator, he had to contain the situation as best he could. Once the crowd dispersed and a litter arrived to return the princess to the palace, Elaine's tears had dried. She rose and stepped beside the litter, calm as a lake on a windless day. The king's investigator understood. Duty, far more powerful than reason, brought her to her feet. The two maids accompanying her gaped in shocked to silenced disbelief. Raymond gestured to the tall woman, and once he had her attention, murmured, "I shall require your relation of this sorry tale later today. You may come to my office whenever you feel ready to talk of what happened here." Elaine nodded, a heavy sob shuddering through her. Satisfied she would do as he requested, Raymond turned back towards his men and finished issuing his orders regarding the witnesses gathered there. Elaine lost track of time. The darkness of her great loss pervaded the world, drowning out all thoughts. She sat, immovable in the gloomy room, so different from how she remembered it. Once it had been filled with light and laughter. Her memories showed her a place alive with time spent playing with her princess. cruel, heartless reminiscences. She sat beside the motionless figure, stroking the dark brown tresses she had held so dear. The stillness in the room became so oppressive, Elaine struggled to breathe. Death reigned here. It was heavy, palpable. With every breath she took, Elaine's life challenged the domain of the Lady of Darkness. Her mantle weighed heavier with every passing sign of defiance from her living body. Elaine stood. It was a sudden movement, abrupt and unexpected. She could not remain. It was impossible for the living to stay in death's chamber. When she crossed the threshold into the princess's antechamber, Elaine heard a gentle voice echoing in her memory. "Come to my office whenever you feel ready to talk." She inhaled and purposefully headed towards the lower levels of the palace, striding through hallways past guards and servants without looking either left or right. Elaine did not notice heads turning at her passing, nor did she hear the whispers that followed after her. She floated in a sea of grey. Nothingness cocooned her in a wad of cotton wool that dulled all sounds. Elaine stood at the top of a set of stairs leading down into a part of the palace she'd never set foot in. She could just make out at the bottom of the flight a door barely tall enough for her to pass through, but wide enough for three of her. Her brain zoomed in on something unexpected. The glass walls she was familiar with gave way to hewn stone here at the foundation of the palace. She blinked at the weight of the rocks in the ground, her awareness shifting to the change in her situation. What would become of her now? She hesitated on the threshold. As companion to the princess, she had never been into the guard's house before, and fear tingled through her as she peeked into the investigator's cellar office. Although all was calm, Elaine shivered. This was where the king's eyes and ears sat, the man who instilled fear in anyone whom he investigated. He was renowned for being the best investigator in living memory and possessing a sharp intelligence. He was a man to be reckoned with. Raymond looked up at the sound of soft, light steps coming down the stairs towards him. His attention was caught by the stark difference to the usual sound of his guards clanking down the stairs, or the pitter-patter of his barefooted informants. First, a pair of fine silk slippers came into view. They were coated in mud. Nonetheless, he could see they were a pale shade of grey-blue to match the hem of the fine skirt that followed. Sprays of mud stained the rich fabric of the skirt, which showed signs of wear at the hem and had a jagged tear at the knee. At this point he recognized his visitor and came to his feet. Picking up a chair from a row lining the wall of his outer office, he placed it closer to his desk in one swift motion, gritting his teeth against a twinge of protest from his left knee. While he performed the task, he surprised himself, noticing his heart rate quicken with the realization she was finally attending on him. As the hours passed since the incident of the morning, he'd been occupied with the horrifying case of the princess's fall. Nevertheless, his thoughts had still drifted to this meeting he'd requested with the companion. He turned to meet her. She stood, hunched over, squinting in the flickering light illuminating his office. She peered out over a gossamer veil, allowing her eyes to adjust, and Raymond crossed the room to greet her. Taking her hand in his, he said, "Thank you for coming. Please take a seat." He gestured towards a chair he'd readied for her. Elaine perched on the edge, her back an impervious column. She waited, her hands folded in her lap, while Raymond stepped around to the other side of his desk. It was littered with papers that he pushed into an untidy pile to his left. Then he pulled a clean sheaf of papers from a drawer and a fountain pen from another. While he readied the inkwell, he turned his attention back to Elaine, saying, "Now then, Miss Elaine, I may address you so, am I right?" She nodded, her companion's veil fluttering about her obscured face in this motion of silent consent. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I most appreciate your support under the circumstances." She said nothing, so he continued. "Kindly recount to me your day, everything that has happened since you woke this morning." Elaine nodded, took a deep breath, and began. "I woke with the chirping of the birds in the pre-dawn, as I always do." She paused and cleared her throat. "I readied myself and prepared Suadesa's wardrobe for the day. Lila brought breakfast, and I did my duty before entering the main bedroom and serving Sualtessa. She was happy, excited. She wondered what her husband-to-be was like. She looked forward to the procession and being seen in public. She was glad for the opportunity to bid her people farewell before being taken to the royal gardens to be presented to her groom. Elaine bit her lip. Raymond saw her swallow, forcing back glimmering tears as they pooled in her pale eyes. She dropped her gaze, shifting in her seat as she did so. Then Elaine murmured, "After breakfast she was dressed. She wore the violet silk of a bride, one day before her wedding." She smiled and laughed so much. Again Elaine's voice faltered, a muscle in her jaw strained. Her voice grew even softer when she continued. "At the strike of mid-morning we were ushered out into the park to join the procession. Sualtessa's bay mare, Mayflower, stood ready. An attendant offered Sualtessa a rare flower, and then she mounted and rode off at the pinnacle of the procession. I joined in at my place behind the royal guards. We were walking towards the palace gates when..." Elaine's voice broke. She trembled for a moment before pulling her hands into fists, scrunching the fabric of her skirt. Raymond held his breath. A part of him wanted to save her from this torment. He wanted to cradle her against him and comfort her, which in and of itself terrified him. "I'm the king's chief investigator. Why can't I pull myself together?" Elaine regained her composure and went on. "Mayflower lost her mind. That horse screamed. It was an ear-splitting screech, and then she bolted." Elaine's voice dropped to a whisper. "I tried to run. I tried to get to her, but I was too slow. She fell before I reached her." Voice quivering, Elaine broke off her account. She turned away as a tremor shook her frame. Raymond found himself looking at a lock of her pale hair which had escaped the confines of her companion's veil, and caressed her neck and shoulder. A single flaxen strand, unusual and yet somehow beautiful. Shifting in his seat, he turned to his notes, but there wasn't much he could ask her. She'd been detailed enough, and he didn't want to put her through more pain. Elaine moved in the chair, and Raymond lifted his gaze, meeting her grey eyes, reminiscent of the endless sea, as they peered above the gossamer veil covering her remaining features. "The princess was dead before I reached her. I expect she broke her neck in the fall." Startled, Raymond made an effort to school his features. To cover his surprise, he said, "Thank you, Miss Elaine, for your candid and detailed report. I am certain it will help me conclude this investigation. Should there be anything else you remember, anything at all, no matter how insignificant the detail may appear, I would be much obliged if you could inform me. In my work it is important to keep everything as detailed as possible." She nodded, rising. "I'm glad to be of use, Mr. She hesitated. Mortification rolled off her, eliciting a disconcerting sensation in Raymond. He knew her training required near perfection from her. His heart constricted at the sight of panic welling in her eyes, and he blurted out, "Raymond. You may call me Raymond Dart, if you please, Miss Elaine." She bobbed a curtsy, and her feet whispered over the flagstones of his office as her skirts vanished out of sight up the curved stairs. Raymond sank back into his stiff chair to write down every detail of her account. His pen scratched over the surface of the paper, recording the words while his mind drifted. Everyone called this woman ugly, and yet Raymond couldn't find any fault with her. Her unusual features gave her an ethereal air and lent her elegance. She was also intelligent. His brow furrowed as he noted down her final words, about the princess having already died from the fall. "A broken neck," he mused to himself. He shook his head, trying to clear it. Then he became aware of the spot of ink blossoming underneath his nib, where it rested on the paper. He'd stopped writing a while ago. Returning the fountain pen to its holder, he sighed and stood. This was going to be a tough case to solve. He felt it in his bones. Although, first things first, he would need to make a report to the king. With leaden feet and a heavy heart, he went to carry out his duty. For Elaine, days passed in a haze of black and grey. She insisted on sewing the princess's shroud herself, by hand. It was her final duty towards Sualtessa, Elaine's heart was a draft animal pulling her inexorably towards accomplishing this charge. She knew it was important. After painstaking hours and the tiniest, near-invisible stitches, she finished her work. However, Elaine found no solace in the task well done. She had no one to share it with. In the past, the purpose of her achievements had always been to goad a lovely, though somewhat lazy princess towards greater accomplishment. Now, Elaine felt as though her whole purpose had been brutally ripped from her. She'd known this day would come. The princess had been in her betrothal procession, after all. Accident or not, the princess wouldn't have had need of a companion for much longer, and Elaine would have been left alone. Her mind echoed with Suertesa's protestations. She wanted Elaine to come with her, and she would accept no exception or argument. Despite the princess's words, Elaine knew there was no place for her at a married woman's side. In the end, her time had run out sooner than expected, that was all. It had been inevitable. She spent days sitting by the window in the princess's darkened chambers, musing on the past. The funeral came and went, but Elaine's eyes remained dry. Her tears had been sucked into the barren wasteland of loss. She noticed the other attendants' eyes boring into her at the funeral. They expected her, the companion, to weep more than anyone else. It was the only response befitting her position as the princess's second shadow. However, Elaine could find no new streams of passionate liquid to quench the scorching emptiness that consumed her. After the funeral, she returned to her place in the princess's chambers, where she remained day in and day out. She found some solace in reminiscences of her interview with the king's chief investigator. Raymond, she had to remind herself. It was easy to lose herself in the memory of his compassionate eyes. In the beginning, his gaze had intimidated her. It was as though nothing escaped him. He could see right into her soul and track the thoughts behind her words and actions. Then, as she shared her experience in every truthful detail, she could remember. She noticed something beyond the formidable exterior of the man who left everyone trembling in fear. He was lonely. He had nothing but his work to occupy his thoughts, and he had no room for mistakes or even to let go for a moment. He was expected to be in control at all times, just as Elaine was expected to always come second. She remembered turning away from him to hide her inner turmoil at the memories his request for information caused in her. Then she'd followed up with a comment about the fall that caused Suertesa's death, and Elaine's mind lingered on his intake of breath and the way his hazel eyes widened at the comment. He, like everyone else, believed Elaine was dim-witted just because she was ugly and always had to prove herself lesser than the princess. Thinking back on the look in Raymond's gaze at that moment, she wondered whether there had really been recognition and a sense of satisfaction at her astute insight. They were the responses she'd gleaned from him at that moment, but could she have been mistaken? At times she wondered whether she had made the whole thing up just to give herself something entertaining to think about. There was also the matter of his esteemed position and undeniable youth to keep her mind occupied. Why would a young man like him prefer to be cooped up in the belly of the palace investigating ill-doing, when he could be an active defender of the royal family as a guard, or perhaps even a knight? As the days wore on, Elaine found her thoughts turning more often to the intense man so much shorter than her. On occasion, she'd even daydream of finding solace in his embrace. She felt heat wash through her face when she pulled herself from such visions and glanced about as though someone might catch her out. Meanwhile, the king and queen lamented their loss in their own ways. Their sorrow pulled them each to different forms of consolation. Nonetheless, both remained disconsolate, not least because while they sought solace in the memory of their daughter, they were constantly drawn back to the present by that creature, the great bird of sorrow, languishing in the princess's chambers in a coal-black gown, which overemphasized the paleness of her unusual skin and hair. They would have to be rid of her. There was no need for the companion. She had to go, and the sooner the better. Word of this decision reached Raymond, who thumped his clenched fist on his desk as soon as his informant was out of earshot. The news of Elaine's imminent dismissal struck him like a dagger in the heart, spreading unexpected sparks of ice through his limbs. They could not do this to her. Not to her. But why? He pondered momentarily. Why react in this way? What was she to him? Still, he pulled himself together and marched straight to the king's chambers without further contemplation. He did not care to scrutinize the real reason for his indignation. He dared not investigate his own emotions too closely, for he knew he wasn't ready to admit the truth to himself. As he stormed, fuming, through the sheer transparent walls of the upper palace, his mind latched onto an excellent reason for keeping the companion close at hand. He knew with some persuasion the king would see reason. Determined to have his way, Raymond marched into the audience room and put forward his petition. Elaine sat in the darkening room, clutching her knees and hugging her legs to her body. Her fair head rested against the wall of the window alcove. She stared out over the park without seeing any of the vegetation. Her mind drifted from the sea of her despair, where all hope was lost, to more pleasant reminiscences of calloused hands holding her own, directing and accompanying her in her grief. In her mind's eye, she traced the curve of Raymond's jaw, its soft angles overshadowed by his stern brow. Then she allowed his compassionate gaze to pierce her, pinning her where she sat. A gentle knock startled Elaine out of her reverie. She looked up while the very man she'd been daydreaming about strode in through the open door. Thanking the heavens for her veil hiding the unequivocal sign of her embarrassment, she uncoiled. Her legs were stiff and unresponsive, and before she could stand, he motioned for her to remain seated. "Please do not trouble yourself on my account, Miss Elaine." His voice was brisk, businesslike. "I have come to inform you that the king instructs me to seek a new situation for you. You shall be leaving the palace tomorrow." He hesitated. She saw surprise in his eyes. Did her blank indifference at the news unsettle him? Why did he care? As his silence drew out, Elaine blurted, "But why task you with such a menial chore? You must have better things to do than deal with the likes of me. I have been waiting on the king's decision for days. I never expected you to be the one to deliver my sentence." Elaine dropped her gaze, heat burning even more fiercely along her ears. She mumbled, "Well, I suppose that is what you do, deliver sentences. Seen from that viewpoint, you are the logical choice." "It is hardly a sentence," Raymond replied, his lips jerked upwards into a grimace that Elaine thought might constitute a smile. "The king will provide a recommendation, and you are allowed to choose a position suiting your abilities." Elaine reeled. "What?" His words reached her, but just as waves recede from the beach leaving smooth sand, she was unable to retain any of what he said. She blinked. Raymond continued, his voice soft and encouraging. "I considered perhaps an apprenticeship at the milliner or the dressmaker would suit your talents very well, since you are quite respected for your fashion advice offered to our beloved princess. May she rest in the arms of the goddess." Elaine looked at him. She still felt his words rain through the sieve that was her brain. How could this be? She was not to be sent out on the street without so much as an adieu. Her conviction that she would end up back in the village of her childhood, or worse, kicked out of the palace and left to rot in the city, was so strong. She'd never imagined the possibility of taking up a trade or continuing a life without her princess. Raymond stepped closer, and Elaine tilted her head to look up at him. Lines of strain webbed their way around the corners of his eyes, and she noted dark shadows in the wells above his cheekbones. The realization of his fatigue brought into stark relief the many cares he bore. He was so devoted. Her heart skipped a beat, and she drew in a sharp breath, noticing Raymond's unique combination of scents for the first time, leather and sweat mixed with ink. An unsettling knot formed in the pit of her stomach, and she forced herself to return her thoughts to what Raymond had said. His dedication really was admirable. She could relate to his loyalty and dutifulness, as it was something she had striven towards her whole life. "Their Royal Highnesses appreciate your dedication to the princess. They would not see you suffer more than you already have as a result of this terrible incident," he asserted. Was that kindness she detected in his voice? "You don't need to make your choice immediately. If you could let me know by the morning, I could have the position arranged for you." Now his concern touched her heart, melting away all her confusion. Elaine smiled at him. "There is no need for any delay, Mr. Dart. I would gladly become an apprentice to the milliner." Pausing to rally her thoughts around the flag of hope he'd raised, she added, "And thank you for your kindness in seeing to my placement. I shall be ready to leave in the morning and shan't take up any more of your precious time." He bowed curtly and left. Elaine stared after him, contemplating the shadowy man whom everyone seemed to fear, and who nonetheless appeared to care about the people who lived in the palace. Instead of feeling threatened by him like so many others she'd overheard over the years, she felt safeguarded by his presence. On the following morning, in the grey pre-dawn, Elaine presented herself in the investigator's office. It was empty. She sat on one of the chairs lining the wall and waited, watching the light creeping into the room from the small window slits set high into the wall. The chill morning air filtered in to her, and she drew her thin dress closer about her. She rubbed her arms to bring some warmth. The sound of boots on the stairs drew her attention away from her own discomfort. She noted the worn leather was well tended, and the man's trousers were a simple cut. They were dark blue. There was something sturdy about them, durable like the boots. She noted the whole ensemble lacked ostentation. Simple practicality was this man's hallmark. The only decoration he wore was a silver pin depicting an eye, which glimmered on his left lapel. He was the king's eyes and ears, after all. Raymond Dart stopped abruptly in the arched entrance as his gaze fell upon her. Elaine bumbled to her feet, startled by the surprise she detected in his eyes. I had expected that you would prefer to inform me of my new position and have me on my way as soon as possible, so as to avoid any further trouble for you," she blurted, while berating herself for taking initiative. Her companion should never think for herself. Keeping her eyes locked on the toes of his boots, Elaine fought with the heat creeping up the back of her neck to her ears. She knew she must be beet red, and that only made matters worse. "Seeing to your welfare is no trouble, Miss Elaine, not in the least," Raymond insisted. "I was startled by your loveliness. The blue of your gown brings out the shade of your hair to perfection, and you are quite becoming without the veil hiding you from view." Elaine squirmed, unable to hold the blush at bay. She felt her cheeks burn to an even more intense shade as she struggled to keep her mind from fixating on his words. Her voice failed her, and she stood there panic-stricken. Her heart thrummed in an electrifying hum. It was the first time anyone had used the word lovely to refer to her. She had never even considered loveliness a remote possibility for her self-description. She sensed him observing her. Nothing slipped past him, and Elaine wondered what he thought, now she was the same shade as a tomato. "If you fetch your things, we can be off directly. That way you can settle into your new home before starting at the milliner's later this afternoon." Elaine lifted her eyes at that. "I have nothing else. Only this dress belongs to me. Everything else was suertesas. I am ready to leave as soon as it suits you." His left eyebrow arched into his forehead. "Then come." Crossing the cobbled courtyard, towards the arched gates leading out of the palace precinct, Raymond considered the young woman who followed behind him by precisely half a pace. He pondered what it must be like to be a woman who owned nothing but the clothes on her back. She didn't even have a cloak to protect her from the morning chill. Raymond considered the injustice of her position, a servant who dutifully fulfilled her purpose with the greatest attention and most humble devotion, only to be cast aside when her services were no longer needed. Her dedication was disregarded along with everything else. To add insult to injury, she suffered prejudice towards her looks. How could they call her unsightly? Heading up the main street towards the Traders' Quarter, Raymond stole a glance at Elaine. She kept pace with him without effort, her head bent and eyes lowered to the ground. Seeing her that way, he noted for the first time how tall she really was. She was taller than he, and Raymond was by no means a short man. Still, her height didn't intimidate him. He imagined it could be daunting for some, which he supposed was part of the reason she was considered unattractive. He noted how she held herself, a study in the word demure, while ensuring each movement was graceful. The blue skirt swirled around her with each stride, and the crisp morning chill turned her cheeks rosy. Beautiful, Raymond thought to himself. It did not take them long to arrive in the narrow streets and several-storied buildings of the trading quarter. The cobbles were more uneven here, and Raymond returned all his attention to where he put his feet. A few turns later, they came into an alley where the brick houses loomed up around them. He stopped in front of a green door, paint peeling from the wooden planks. He rapped on it, and it swung inward, revealing a rotund woman with silver streaks in her shoulder-length black hair. She took in the silver pin Raymond wore on the lapel of his jacket and bobbed her head, stepping aside for him to come inside. She spoke breathlessly, wheezing through stained teeth and gesturing up the stairs. "The loft room, my lord, right at the top it is. Good space, fine enough view if you care for such things." He nodded and began the ascent, leaving the landlady on the ground floor. Following an intense climb of 4 steep flights of stairs, which incited protest from his left knee, Raymond opened the door into a room divested of trappings. A plain bed graced the wall opposite the warped door, and nothing but dust covered the otherwise empty space. Raymond was on the verge of closing the door. He turned, his lips forming the first syllable of a suggestion to find something better suited to her. Then he saw Elaine's eyes gleam as she peered over his shoulder into the barren cell behind him. For the first time since he'd met her, Elaine made an impulsive movement. She pushed past him into the room. She glanced about, life bubbling up within her as she took in the space in its entirety. While Raymond stood in the doorway, he watched the contours of her face change. Excitement thrummed inside her. He could see her decorating the room in her mind, adapting it to how she imagined it. Elaine was like a blossom, unfolding in the life-giving warmth of the sun. Energy poured through her, and it was a sight to behold. Gone was the drab avian companion to death who had lurked in the princess's chambers. It was replaced by a young woman in the prime of her life, brimming with emotion. She pulled open the gable window and flung the shutters against the wall with a bang. Orange light streamed into the room, and motes of dust, thrown up in her passing, danced in the rays of the morning. Raymond couldn't take his eyes off her. Elaine stood looking out into the street, her tresses dancing, shimmering in the sunlight. It turned into a fiery halo when she spun about with the skirt of her dress billowing around her. "This is wonderful," she breathed. "Thank you." Everything about her was changed. There was nothing demure about the excited gleam in her eyes as she bounced on the balls of her feet. Raymond heard his heart beating at a faster tempo than usual. His mouth ran dry and he swallowed. He observed the tall woman and the radiance coming from her. The blossom he saw unfold was exquisite. Elaine turned back to peer out at the street below, and Raymond's gaze hitched on the contours of her figure and the way her deep blue skirt cascaded off her hips. He felt an uncomfortable tightness in his trousers. Clamping down on the thoughts and emotions overwhelming him, Raymond bit down hard on the inside of his cheek. Then he realized she was speaking. Her words poured around him, but he couldn't grasp what she said. It felt like his head was underwater. The sound of her voice filtering through the resistance of a thicker substance. "Is everything in order, Mr. Dart?" His perception shifted, and he heard her once more. The look of concern in her eyes made him even more aware of the fast tempo of his heart and the unexpected emotions warring for control of his body. More than anything, he wanted to cross the room, encircle her with his arms, and pull her lips to his. Yes, quite fine." He turned away, wanting to leave, to cut off the puppet strings his instincts were tugging at. Then he remembered her recommendation. He fumbled in the inside pocket of his coat. For a man of acumen and integrity, the state of befuddlement was insufferable. "Your recommendation from the king. Also, the rent is paid. For 2 weeks, that is." He handed her the sheaf of paper. There was a soft rustle as it changed hands. "Thank you," she murmured. Elaine hesitated a moment and then asked, "The milliner's shop where I'll be taking up my apprenticeship is the one on the corner?" She pointed out the window to the left. Raymond nodded. "Yes, that's the one." Then he turned and was down the first flight of stairs before he realized how rude he'd been. He shook his head, clearing the remnants of his confusion, and headed down to the ground floor. Raymond didn't look back, asserting his self-control with an iron will, but still after a few steps his stride faltered. Why was he so reluctant to leave? He had other duties to attend to, and yet he wanted to spend his time observing her, absorbing her enthusiasm, sparked into being by a tiny empty hole at the top of a rickety staircase. He realized he couldn't begin to fathom the contrasts of the situation so unique to a companion to a princess. Was this tradition really fair? He wondered. Raymond shook his head in irritation. He was not supposed to question. His purpose was to get the job done. Pushing aside all thoughts of Elaine and her loft room, he strode to the palace, turning his mind back onto the tricky investigation he was conducting. His was a delicate situation, and he imagined things were going to get worse for him before they got any better, if at all. Elaine stared after Raymond through the window. When he'd vanished from view around the street corner, she shook her head. Odd, she murmured to herself. Then she allowed the strange encounter to fall from her mind. She wanted to accomplish much before presenting herself at the milliner's, and it seemed a waste to lavish her attention on the inexplicable behavior of a man she barely knew. She rolled up her sleeves, determination taking control of her features. She remembered seeing a broom on the landing and set about cleaning her new home. Before long, dust swirled in the rays of sunlight illuminating the wooden floor. Having swept up as much as she could, Elaine allowed her gaze to encompass the room. It would do. A good place to begin this first step of learning to live and stand on my own 2 feet. Ideas began dancing in her mind, outlining possibilities for decorating the room. She'd be living there, and she had the opportunity to make it her own. Unlike a room at the palace, and the reminders at every turn that it was on loan to her for the duration of her service, this was her place, her abode, and she could do as she pleased. Elaine felt satisfaction lift the corners of her mouth. She was amazed at how fast things were progressing. In the past day, she'd gone from destitute and grieving companion to Elaine, milliner's apprentice and boarder. She was a woman taking her life into her own hands and doing something worthwhile with her time. Excitement thrummed through her whole being when she thought of the work awaiting her. For the first time in her life, her performance was not dependent on another's abilities. She could do things to the best of her capability without fear. That knowledge had her skipping down the stairs when she heard the mid-morning bell reverberate across the distance from the palace. The milliner's shop was a small store with an even smaller back room where 3 women worked. Elaine's arrival elicited some grumbling from 2 of the workers, while the third, Stefania, Elaine's junior by a few years, beamed at her before launching into a monologue about life in the city, and more trivia than Elaine could reasonably expect to ever have any practical use for. Weeks passed in a blur. The new people she met, skills she learned, and the need to keep herself occupied to avoid the pressure of heavy thoughts helped time take wing. Elaine was satisfied with her master's appreciation of her work and the companionship she received from the other women working beside her in the confined room. It was a soothing balm for the constant ache in her chest. She pushed aside her thoughts of the princess, the longing for the deep bond she'd shared with Suartesa, and focused all her attention on sewing, cutting, weaving, and decorating hats for noble ladies and gentlemen. On occasion her mind wandered to the king's investigator and what he might be up to, or recalling the intense looks he'd given her during their last encounter. The memory of his stare sent electrifying chills flashing up and down her spine. Elaine soon learned to keep a tight lid on her contemplations or suffer being cajoled with eager questions from her workmates, who sensed some deeper significance in Elaine's musings and insisted on knowing who the mysterious man was who could turn sweet Elaine so pink and tongue-tied. She fended them off bravely, refusing to give in to their prodding, and eventually they let the matter rest, at least until the next time she allowed her mind to wander. Once a week, she was given leave to work. She was given the opportunity to leave work in the early afternoon to do her groceries at the market. On one such excursion, Elaine stopped at the fruit vendor and contemplated the sweet star and dragon fruits, reminders of her former life. She never bought these exotic products, knowing the market only sold what had been rejected by the palace kitchen. However, she loved to muse over the precious memories of the princess, recalling the closeness they had shared. Elaine's thoughts were cut short when shouts rose up from beside the spice vendor's stand. She glanced up at the sound. People were closing in on the stall, and something drew her forward even though her first instinct was to avoid trouble. Her curiosity, piqued by the cries of dismay, egged her on, and she made her way towards the stand with its red awning, bleached pink by sun and rain. There were others jostling to see. The spice vendor, an elderly man with thinning salt and pepper hair, sat slumped forward on his stool. One of the onlookers shook him, causing the heavy-set man to topple off the seat and fall over onto the ground, strewn with the remains of the previous day's market produce. A series of screams rippled through the crowd as realization dawned on the onlookers. The man, who'd been a permanent feature of the market for over 20 years, was no longer among the living. Elaine had a brilliant view of his prostrate body lying on the ground. Someone turned him over. Dead eyes stared skyward, and Elaine froze. At the sight of the man, she was sucked back into her previous experience with death. Horrible chills crawled over her tall frame, sending shockwaves of revulsion through her. Her mind superimposed the memory of her beloved princess and the way she too had lain on the ground, limp and unresponsive. The city guard arrived and began dispersing the crowd. They cordoned off the stall, shooing the passers-by who craned their necks to see despite the wall of flesh and armor. One guard unsuccessfully tried to make Elaine move along. She was head and shoulders taller than him and stood rooted to the spot. Nothing the guardsman did could induce her to step away from the scene. Another guard approached. Words were exchanged between them, and vaguely Elaine overheard their irritation. As their words filtered through to her, she became aware of a feeling of faintness spreading through her skull. It swam, the shimmering heat reflection humming in her mind and sending hot and cold flushes through her body. She felt on the verge of collapse. "Do you think she saw a ghost?" one of them asked the other, while waving his hand before her eyes in an attempt to get her attention. Elaine saw right through both of them, their presence a distant essence unable to distract her from the image burning itself into her retinas. Death followed her. Glassy eyes rimmed in pink stared at nothing, through everything. Cold tingled over Elaine, making its numbing journey deep into her bones. She was being sucked under, dragged towards depths, where darkness lurked, and cold reigned supreme. And I will have to leave it there for today. I hope you enjoyed this reading of The Companion's Tale. The story is available for free, so you're welcome to check out the link in the description here and grab your copy while you can. I would like to also thank Tirza for this opportunity to read here, and I'm really looking forward to my next reading, which is The Last Warrior, and will be in 3 weeks' time, towards the end of the month. And The Last Warrior is another one of the Wordmage's tales, so another tale of this style, but also very different. Well, thank you very much, and have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in the world, and thanks for joining me today.